don't know how familiar many of you are with the park, but Fort Blakeley is what was the object of the battle that occurred here, the federal forces that laid siege to it. But Fort Blakeley is not one single fortification. When the traditional sense of the term fort, you think of one barricade or something. It was really a 3-mile long, interconnected series of earthworks. So there's a series of earthworks anchored on the river on this side, and there's a good place to understand where it was anchored. You see that roof, you see that building, that house roughly stands on what was Redoubt 1. There were 9 small forts along that line, spaced out 3 miles, anchored on the north and the south end of the river. The entire Confederate line, except what Redoubt 1, still exists, and the park owns most or all of that. But that gives you a good understanding of where that northern edge of that line was. And that line was a big arc. So this would have been as close to the river as it got here, and it swung out in a big arc all the way to the southern end. That is Fort Blakeley. Now, when I tell people that the battle for Mobile in the Civil War was fought on the eastern shore, there's a lot of questions of why and logistics and all that. So let me try to get it in a nutshell what was going on here. So the campaign for Mobile is the campaign in the spring of 1865 to capture the city of Mobile. This is not the Battle of Mobile Bay. Mobile Bay, that's August of 1864, that's Admiral Farragut, that's damn the torpedoes, that's the naval battle, that's August of 1864. That campaign was not designed to capture Mobile. Farragut wanted to capture the city of Mobile. It was one of the largest cities in the Confederacy. It ends up being the last major city in the Confederacy to surrender. But Farragut, after that battle, he had secured those lower forts. He had stopped Confederate shipping in and out of Mobile Bay. He went up to take a look at what the Confederates had at Mobile. Fortifications around the city, floating batteries, warships, minefields, all kinds of obstructions. And he said that it's going to take us at least 40,000 men to capture this place. He didn't have that at the time. As it turns out, when the campaign for Mobile got underway in the spring of 1865, the Federal Army sent 45,000 troops to capture Mobile and over 3 dozen warships. One of the larger combined forces operations in the war, certainly in this area. We've completely forgotten about it in history a lot of times because something else was happening in April of 1865 that gets a lot more attention. April 9th, 1865, specifically, which is when the battle occurred here. Anybody know what happened April 9th, 1865? I'm sure some do. I know this guy right here does, but I won't draw a picture of Mr. Bullhead. But April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered his army. A lot of people assumed that meant the total end of the war. It did not. He surrendered his army. There were other Confederate armies in the field. These guys here were under no orders to lay down arms. There was no defending Mobile, and the guys attacking were under orders to capture. So the campaign continued. So what the Confederates had done, why they put so much of their men, they only had about 10,000 men in the whole district, and they put most of them on the eastern shore of Tennessee. Spanish whip, because we were discussed, against the battlefield during the cruise. They put them over here for 2 reasons. One, to defend sort of a backdoor access into Mobile. There's a roundabout way you can sail into Mobile from the north, which is the transportation side. But more directly, most importantly, they put most of their fortifications and troops over here because this defended the waterways. If you could get up these waterways, you could connect with the Alabama, the Mississippi River system, go all the way up into the Confederate City and Communication and Transportation Center in their back doors. They went into interior Alabama. So the commander of the whole operation, General Canby, was given that option, and he chose. He said, "I want to capture Mobile and then proceed north." He wasn't very comfortable with potentially having an enemy force in his rear as he went to central Alabama. So he was going to deal with Mobile first, and to deal with Mobile, you had to deal with Blakeley and Spanish Fort. So both of these are earthen fortifications that are interconnected. We'll talk about Spanish Fort, which came under siege a little bit earlier than Blakeley, a few days earlier. We'll talk a bit when we get to the south. But both of them were under siege by early April 1865. The siege at Blakeley is going to last 8 days. And basically during this siege, where the siege is, the military, they're trying to get closer and closer to their objective. So the Federals are digging earthworks. They end up digging 3 parallels of trenches. almost entirely all of that survives today. There's few sections, but most of it's still there. We've got about 12 miles of earthworks in the park, and 3/4 of it's new. But these landmines, they called them torpedoes at the time, that in certain places in front of those lines had been positioned. So the Federals are trying to advance these trenches at night, and the Confederates have all these obstructions, and they also, to slow them down, would fire calcium light mortar shells like a big Roman candle up in the air just to illuminate the battlefield just long enough to figure out where they are and train their guns on. So it's a round-the-clock operation during those 8 days. The Confederates are greatly outnumbered with this. The Federals at Blakeley had about 16,000 men. The Confederates about 3,500, and the Confederate troops, about half of them were veterans of every battle that you probably heard of in the Western Theater, in Vicksburg, Atlanta, Nashville. Some of the other half, though, were guys who had not seen any real service at all. There are the Confederates derisively called them the Boy Brigade. After the battle, there are accounts of Federal troops who said literally laying in the trenches, dead after the battle, were teenagers too young to shave, next to older men with white beards. So it was quite literally the last man the Confederacy could muster. These guys were drafted in and put into service, conscripted at the last moment, and not served in any other battle. But you put all that together, you got about 3,500 men of varying degrees of experience and reliability, and they were trying to hold these guys off as long as they could. April 9th, 1865 comes, and the reason they chose that specific date was because of what happened at Spanish Fort on April 8th, which we'll tell you about. Spanish Fort was evacuated, so they rushed up plans to assault Fort Blakeley by a mass charge of 16,000 guys across the field. There are accounts of Federal troops who were involved in that saying that they could look and see for a solid mile in either direction of it, a wave of troops coming across that field with all that cleared brush. And where we just were, on that very northern end of the line, and incidentally, we're now coming, we passed readouts 2, 3, 4, 5, we're probably somewhere around readout 6, where our reenactment's going to take place today, our living history demonstrations, I should say, if you went straight out that way. So we're still coming past behind Blakeley. The northern end of the line is very unique nationally because that is where the Federal troops assaulting that portion of the line, over 4,000 of the troops there were United States colored troops. That's what they were called at the time. Former slaves, volunteered to fight. Their presence here in the battle, taking part in that charge, ranks as one of the largest concentrations of African American soldiers in any Civil War battle. So what happened here is very important locally, but I always tell people really what our national significance is, maybe that we've got that unique occurrence on the northern end of our battlefield. So the rest of the battle is guys charging across that 3-mile line at the same time, depending on the terrain, where they're at, and all the obstacles, they arrive at those readouts at different times. So when they charge, they're focusing on each of these readouts where the Confederates have their men and artillery massed. Where we're doing our living history demonstrations today, where we got our tent set up and all that, that's in front of readout 6. So that is one of those places that they would have been focused on. We're now coming back towards the end of the line here. I'll point out where readout 9 ends. Where we pass the park property, you cannot see readout now, but I'll give you a good indication of where it is. So Blakeley is assaulted April 9th, 1865. That's a Sunday. It's 5:30 p.m. By 6:30 p.m., it's getting dark, and the battle's essentially over. The very last of the Confederate troops, almost the entire garrison was captured. We know several dozen were killed. Only a few dozen escaped the battle. And the ones that escaped had fled to the waterfront, were trying to swim across the water with pulling up planks from the dock. Some were killed in the water. Some were shot in the water in the Tensaw River. The commander of the garrison surrendered somewhere on the waterfront. Do not know the exact spot. And then some of the very few of the Confederate troops that escaped did so by getting on the front of a ironclad vessel, the CSS Nashville, which was in the area, one of the larger ironclads that the Confederacy built. The captain heard and saw what was happening, nosed the boat up to shore approximately where he boarded, and took these guys who were scrambling to get away from the advancing Federals on the front of that boat, backed them up, backed up the boat, deposited them on the other shore under hell of fire. So that is how the roughly 75 or so that we think escaped, probably better than half of them escaped on that boat. We don't know how the rest got out. We know there's one or two accounts of guys who followed the water lines and swaps, managed to make an escape. We don't know all the stories, so we're still looking for those stories. But that is how the few that escaped did. And the whole time I'll be talking, we've been going in front of Blakeley. You look out to your left, straight out that direction. You can see there's a little marsh, and then you see the hardwoods pick up, and there's a bluff that ascends slowly there. Right out in that direction is Redoubt 9. So we've been going from Redoubt 1, where that house was, to Redoubt 9. That is the Blakeley battlefield. So as I always say, if you're in the park, you're on the battlefield. Now we have an area of the park that we call on our maps the battlefield. That's the only area that we have completely cleared, open, that you can see between the federal and the Confederate lines today. That's where we do most of our reenactments. Now today, for this special living history demonstration, we're not there, we're at Redoubt 6, which is very close to it. But if you want to see the rest of the battlefield, it's easy to find those spots, but in truth, anywhere in the park, you're on a battlefield. So that is Fort Blakeley, a little bit of history of Fort Blakeley. What we'll do next is get underway, we'll need a little bit more speed. We're going to go down to another spot that features the fences that the Confederates created to help defend this post that you can only get to by water. You cannot. And directly ahead of us at the highest point of the land, you see the highest trees out there in the distance. Those pines, the highest point, that is one of the anchor points of those smaller fortifications that collectively define Spanish Fort. That's Fort McDermott is underneath all that. That's the only part of the Spanish Fort battlefield you can really easily visit and understand what happened there. It's owned by the local Southern Confederate Veterans Camp. It is free access, it's a Civil War fortification, it is interpreted, and all around in our houses, and all throughout what was the Spanish War battlefield, where the siege took place in Spanish Fort subdivision. So you don't have a battlefield in the way you do at Blakeley to visit. But it's still interpreted fairly well if you want to go throughout the neighborhood. There's a series of historic markers and things where you can understand where things work. There's some remnants of them that provide. But Spanish Fort, of course, being south of Blakeley, the Federal Army that's laying siege to this is coming up from the south. So the first place they get before they get to Blakeley is Spanish Fort. So a lot of them stop there, and ultimately you end up with an even more lopsided affair taking place in Spanish Fort. Blakeley, you had 3,500 Confederates. They're besieged by 16,000 Confederates. Here you have roughly 2,500 Confederates, and they ultimately are besieged at one point by over 30,000 Confederates. Pretty serious odds. The commander of the garrison actually said, just took that word to Pierce. He said that he had served throughout the war. He said, I've never served at a place more dangerous because I got fewer men with an enemy that's multiple times larger than me. I've never been disadvantaged. I've never had them closer. I've never had them with more artillery, and my men have never been further apart. So he's basically saying, I'm going to hold it as long as I can, but I'm not sure how long I can hold it. So they held out from March 27th all the way to April 8th, which remember is the day before Blakeley. What happened that day, April 8th, is that the Federals had gotten so close to the Spanish Fort garrison that the Confederates really could not return fire. I mean, they physically could not poke their head above their lines, command their guns, just because there's so many Federals surrounding them, they're literally just sitting ducks. So they're just enduring this bombardment. And they're making plans for what to do next. The Federals get so close that they determine that they're going to just make some little sorties, little advances out and figure out if there's a weak spot in the Confederate line, they can go ahead and force them to surrender. So they're doing that and actually successfully find one on the evening of April 8th, right at dusk, right as the sun's going down. They find this, and they think that they have found a place to drive a wedge and to basically divide the Confederate fortifications in half. And they report back to their commander and tell him what they have found. And the sun's going down, it's getting dark, and they've got overwhelming odds. And he said, let's resume this in the morning. Go into camp tonight. If we're there, we'll resume it in the morning. We'll capture them tomorrow. Well, the Confederate garrison realized what was going on. They didn't realize what they'd done, but the Confederate Army realized that they had essentially had their army already surrounded and divided into two sections, and determined to make a quick escape if they could. So they, when the order was given to evacuate Spanish Fort that night, they came down the hill. You can see where the boathouses are. There's a great place right as we're passing right on time here. Out to my right, your left, you can see a house on that bluff. You can see where that boathouse is. It's trimmed, the tree. You can see the height of that bluff. They came down the bluff very near that spot. Descended that at night. The order that they were given no verbal orders. Everything was arranged. They said don't shout any orders. Even had soldiers, some reputedly had to take off their shoes as they entered the little boardwalk that was down here that had been built to bring supplies into the garrison. They stealthily evacuated and came out to this marsh right in front of us, and that is where they waited on Confederate transports who come in the middle of the night, pick them up, and take them over to Mobile. Very few made their way up to Blakeley. But as all this was happening, it was happening at night. Once it began to be light the next day, the Federals realized that they are beginning to prepare to resume a siege on an empty garrison. So they had given them the complete slip. So the Federal command, having fought day and night for 2 weeks here, and over a week at Blakeley, and having men die every day, said wherever you are at Blakeley, we're going to make an assault. We're going to capture Blakeley. Do not give them a chance to escape. The last thing they wanted to do was to do all of this over in Mobile a third time. They had no interest in capturing empty earthworks. They wanted to capture the army. So they rushed ahead plans to assault Blakeley. So that's the connection between the fall of the Spanish Fort and Blakeley and why it occurred back-to-back days. So this gives you a good understanding of where Spanish Fort is. I know you don't see earthworks and all to make sense of it, but that's McDermott, which is on the southern end, and you've got 2 or 3 other major fortifications that are scattered throughout Spanish Fort Estates, basically on that bluff. But you can tell a little bit of the terrain and understand that there was a pretty significant bluff that they commanded. At the time of the war, just like at Blakeley, a lot of this would have been cleared out. You could see that. The Federal Navy, this is where I always mention the fact that this is a combined forces operation. I discussed the fact that we had 36 federal warships involved in this. They were just south of the bridges, out just at the head of the bay. Their original plan was to get up and to shell these Confederate lines, and they tried that, but they could not get really close enough to have the sort of effect they wanted because of what the Confederates had done. It was not ships that the Confederates could get down here and deal with. What they did was send floating mines down the river. And the Federals actually lost 7 boats sunk right in these waterways here to these mines. So there was a pretty deadly operation. They eventually devised a little minesweeper device to go on boats that would go up and clear the area of mines, but as soon as they would do that, there were more that the Confederates would float at night. So they would just litter this place with mines, and a lot of those boats were sunk. All were raised because they were to be sinking about 20 feet of water, and the boat from the keel to the top it's about 25 feet or so, and so you would see the top of these things. They could get the guns off, and then they could raise the hull. So they did that. So those boats are not here. But a few of the guys, the sailors who perished in some of those incidents, are actually still buried here. There's a few that are over in Montrose and Daphne that are still buried here, Federal soldiers who died during that operation. Others had their bodies sent back to New Orleans and on to home, wherever home was.